Hello guys, welcome to Hidden Timelines. Tonight we travel back to November of 1479 to the fortress palace of Toledo. The air is thick with candle smoke and the stone corridors echo with a sound both primal and royal, the cries of Queen Isabel of Castile in the throes of childbirth. Servants and guards wait outside some whispering prayers, others straining to catch news. The dynastic union of Castile and Aragon hangs upon every birth, every cry, every fragile breath of a new infant. Inside the chamber, midwives move with practiced urgency. Shadows of their movements flicker on the damp stone walls as they fan the exhausted queen, who grips the sheets and summons her strength. Es una niña su majestad, the chief. Midwife finally announces, holding aloft the small red-faced newborn whose first cries pierce the silence. Isabel, pale and drenched in sweat, forces a weary smile. Juana, she murmurs, baptizing her daughter not with water, but with breath and intention. In the antechamera, King Fernando, restless and alert, receives the news. He steps in, his eyes glinting with both paternal warmth and political calculation. A daughter, another thread in the fragile tapestry of dynastic survival. Otra hija sana, he remarks quietly, studying the infant's features as though they were a treaty in miniature. For him, every child of Isabel is not only flesh of their flesh, but also an alliance waiting to be forged, a kingdom waiting to be bound. But no one present could foresee what destiny awaited this girl, born into a palace already haunted by the heavy responsibilities of empire. Juana would grow in the shadow of elder siblings, her sister Isabel heir, presumptive until the long-awaited birth of their brother, Juan, Prince of Asturias. For now, she was simply another princess, and yet even in her fragile first cries, history would one day claim her as a figure who would alter the genetic and political map of Europe. This was not a simple birth, it was a political event. In 1479, the Iberian Peninsula was still trembling from the wars that had united Castile and Aragon. The crowns of two great realms had been brought together, not by conquest but by the marriage of Isabel and Fernando, a marriage itself forged through struggle and negotiation. The fate of this union depended upon heirs, sons and daughters alike. Sons would inherit crowns, but daughters were just as valuable, for they were living treaties able to bind Spain to Burgundy, Austria, England, or Portugal. The chamber smelled of sweat incense and candle wax, but beneath those scents lingered the sharper odour of politics. Each birth meant another piece placed on the chessboard of Europe. And Isabel, despite her exhaustion, knew it. She had been born a pawn herself, once passed over, once doubted, and now crowned queen in her own right. Perhaps that is why she smiled faintly. Even in her weakness, she recognized that her daughter Juana too would be more than a child. She would be a vessel of destiny caught in the dangerous machinery of dynastic ambition. Fernando, gazing down at the newborn, could not have known the irony that history would one day lay bare. For this girl, so small and helpless in his hands, would not simply marry into another royal house. She would carry with her a legacy, both brilliant and cursed, a flame of power and fragility that would echo across centuries. The palace quieted again, as if the walls themselves were catching their breath. Outside, the bells of Toledo rang, announcing to the city that a new infanta had been born. The people cheered, for a royal child meant prosperity, meant hope, meant the promise of stability. Yet history whispers otherwise, that hope can curdle into tragedy, that a child's cries can become the prelude to a dynasty's undoing. For Juana of Castile, later called La Loca, her life would be marked not just by her own choices, but by the weight of the crown she never asked to wear. Born in blood and candlelight, she would grow into a figure remembered less for her mind and her heart than for the political machinery that consumed them. And so it begins in Toledo in the year 1479 with the cries of a mother, the breath of a newborn, and the silent turning of the wheel of history. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now, softly tell me, where are you listening from? The infant who had once filled Toledo's palace with her first cries soon grew into a child whose gaze was sharper than her years. By the age of 5, Juana de Castilla already displayed a rare appetite for knowledge. Her first tutor, the Italian humanist Pedro Martir de Angleria, quickly realized he was not dealing with an ordinary royal pupil. When other children stumbled over declensions, Juana breezed through them. When others grew restless with parchment and quills, she leaned closer, hungry for more. Esta infanta posee una mente privilegiada. Angleria confided to Queen Isabel. Aprende con más rapidez que muchos príncipes a quienes he conocido. Isabel, who had fought her own battles against doubt and dismissal, before seizing her crown, listened with quiet pride. She was determined that her daughters would not be ornamental figures to be displayed at courts abroad, but women equipped with the same intellectual weapons as men. At a time when most European princesses were trained in needlework etiquette and piety, and little more Juana and her sisters studied grammar, rhetoric, mathematics, philosophy, history, music and dance. It was a radical vision disguised as maternal duty. Beatriz Galindo, known as La Latina for her mastery of the ancient tongue, joined Angleria in shaping Juana's mind. With her, the young infanta dissected passages of Cicero, untangled the maxims of Aristotle, and recited Virgil until the verses seemed to spill effortlessly from her lips. Galindo demanded precision and clarity, qualities she herself had wielded in a world that rarely welcomed learned women. Juana thrived in such an atmosphere, soaking in texts that most noble sons of Europe never encountered. Often she was found in the palace gardens clutching a volume of Latin, or a codex of scripture, her lips moving silently as she traced each word. Other times she debated with her tutors, her voice carrying a force that startled the courtiers passing by. Demasiado vehemente para una dama de suposición whispered, her mistress of the chamber, Doña Elvira de Mendoza, tiene opinión sobre todo y no teme expresarla. This vehemence was not only temperament, it was a reflection of Isabel's philosophy. The queen believed that the strength of Castile lay not merely in armies and silver, but in wisdom and discipline. Her daughters, she declared, must be as prepared to rule by intellect as their brother Juan was by birthright. The instruction of Juana was thus a declaration to Europe the Trastamara dynasty would not offer fragile ornaments to foreign courts, but formidable minds. And yet this brilliance carried its risks. The court observed Juana with a mix of awe and unease. In the England of her contemporary Elizabeth of York, royal daughters were praised for meekness. In Burgundy they were trained to charm and to dance. In the France of Anne of Austria, women occasionally advised kings, but rarely with open passion. Juana, by contrast, seemed unwilling to dim her fire for the sake of convention. Queen Isabel watched her daughter's development with pride, but also with a flicker of concern. She knew the fate of women in courts across Europe. Those too submissive were forgotten. Those too forceful were feared. El fuego que arde en ella deberá ser controlado, Isabel warned King Fernando one evening. Su pasión puede ser su fuerza, o su perdición. The queen's words were prophetic, for in the world Juana was destined to enter, passion was a dangerous currency. Too little and a princess became invisible. Too much and she became unstable in the eyes of men eager to dismiss her. Already the outlines of her fate were visible, an education that sharpened her beyond the tolerance of courtiers, and a temperament that refused to be contained by the narrow frame allotted to princesses. For now, however, Juana was still only a girl in a palace, her laughter mingling with her siblings, her hands smudged with ink, her eyes alive with curiosity. But history was already watching, already judging, already whispering that the mind of this child would one day unsettle both kings and empires. By the time Juana reached adolescence, the quiet wonder of her precocious childhood had sharpened into something harder, something more difficult to manage. The girl who once devoured Latin texts in the garden was now a young woman with a voice that refused to be confined to the silences expected of a princess. She debated her tutors openly, sometimes fiercely, her words quick and unrelenting, her eyes burning with conviction. Courtiers often paused in the galleries to listen, half in admiration, half in alarm. She discute como si fuera un príncipe, one of her attendants whispered, shaking her head. To be compared to a male heir was not praise. It was a warning. In a world where daughters were meant to be pliant, Juana's insistence on speaking with authority seemed like a dangerous fire. At court, every gesture was judged. The Spanish palaces of the late 15th century were not merely residences, they were theatres of power. Etiquette dictated when one might smile, when one might step forward, even how one might sit in the presence of the sovereign. Within this rigid choreography, Juana stood out. If she felt an injustice in a debate, she pressed the point until her tutors grew red with exasperation. If she encountered a text she found flawed, she said so outright, quoting counter-examples with precision. Doña Elvira de Mendoza, her mistress of the chamber, often tried to temper her. Too vehement, mi señora, she would caution softly. A princess is not meant to defeat her tutors in argument. Princes may display fire, princesses must display grace. Yet Juana rarely softened her tone. She had been taught to reason, and reason demanded expression, not silence. Queen Isabel, watching this development, felt the tug of pride and dread. She recognized herself in her daughter, the same steel, the same refusal to be diminished. Isabel's own youth had been spent resisting attempts to sideline her, to marry her off without power. Now as queen, she understood the dangers of such intensity when wielded by a daughter destined for marriage alliances rather than sovereign command. Ese fuego en ella deberá ser controlado, Isabel confided to Fernando. Puede darle fuerza, o destruirla. Fernando Mora pragmatic saw in Juana both opportunity and risk. Her brilliance could make her a formidable consort able to navigate the politics of foreign courts, but her stubbornness, if unchecked, could turn allies into enemies. For him, a daughter was a bridge to power elsewhere. What mattered was whether the bridge would hold or collapse under its own weight. Behind these parental calculations lurked a shadow few spoke aloud, Isabel's own mother. Queen Isabel of Portugal had spent her final years in seclusion at Arevalo, consumed by melancholy and visions that courtiers whispered were madness. The Queen remembered well the silence of her mother's rooms, the heavy curtains drawn, the prayers whispered for her recovery. Looking at Juana, Isabel sometimes wondered whether the same flame of brilliance was also a spark of danger inherited and waiting. In other courts of Europe, princesses were trained to conceal such tendencies. In France, Anne of Brittany's daughters were schooled in obedience and charm. In England, Elizabeth of York's children were moulded into symbols of Tudor stability. In Burgundy, the Valois princesses dazzled with music and pageantry but rarely dared to argue policy. Juana, by contrast, lived in a court where her mother valued intellect as much as devotion. It was an extraordinary gift, but it made her unusual, and unusual was perilous. Whispers began to follow her, too stubborn, too passionate, too alive. Some courtiers muttered about sangre mora, a way of attributing her intensity to distant traces of non-Castilian ancestry. Others saw in her an echo of the very traits that had carried Isabel herself to the throne. Juana's adolescence was a paradox, a triumph of education and spirit, but also a foreshadowing of the conflicts to come. She was admired and feared, praised and cautioned, celebrated and whispered about in equal measure. Every word she spoke became evidence for one judgment or another that she would be brilliant, or that she would be dangerous. And through it all, Juana walked the marble corridors with her head high, unaware, or perhaps unwilling, to accept that the very fire which set her apart would one day be called madness by those who sought to silence her. The year was 1496, and the roads of Castile carried a young princess toward a destiny she had not chosen. Juana, barely 16, set out from Spain on a journey that would carry her across seas and kingdoms to the heart of Flanders, where the House of Habsburg awaited her. For weeks, storms battered her ships and icy winds clawed at her procession as they made their way through foreign lands. The crossing itself was perilous. Sailors whispered prayers, and courtiers clutched relics as waves threatened to swallow the fleet whole. For Juana, the voyage was not only a passage across waters, but a crossing into a life where her every gesture would be measured against the expectations of empires. When at last the carriages approached Brussels, the young Infanta stepped into a world more opulent than anything she had known. The great hall of the Coudenberg Palace shimmered under a canopy of light. Thousands of candles burned in bronze chandeliers, their flames mirrored in gilt tapestries that draped the stone walls. Burgundy had a reputation for extravagance, and tonight it had outdone itself. The air was thick with incense perfumes imported from the Levant, and the sharp tang of wine already flowing among the guests. Musicians played their melodies, weaving through the chatter of nobles who had come to witness not merely a wedding, but the reshaping of Europe. Su Alteza la Infanta Doña Juana de Castilla y Aragon the Herald announced. A murmur rippled through the chamber as she entered her crimson brocade gown, threaded with gold catching every flicker of light. Her hair, long and chestnut, fell in soft waves beneath a veil framing a face that carried both the severity of her mother Isabel and the quiet fire of her father Fernando. At the far end of the hall stood her betrothed Philip, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy. Even before he moved, his presence filled the room. Tall, golden-haired, his blue eyes bright with self-assurance, Philip was everything rumour had promised. He was called El Hermoso the Handsome not only for his striking appearance, but for the charm that seemed to radiate effortlessly from him. He smiled when their eyes met, confident, almost playful. Juana, schooled in the restraint of the Castilian court, returned his gaze with composure, though inside she felt a storm. For months she had heard of this man who would be her husband, This strange who represented not affection, but alliance. And yet here he was alive, disarmingly beautiful, and staring at her with a confidence she found at once unsettling and magnetic. He greeted her in halting Castilian bienvenida, a Flandes mi señora. Espero que el viaje no haya sido demasiado fatigoso. His accent was heavy, but his intent clear. Juana, who had mastered French, replied fluently in his own tongue, Todo viaje tiene su propósito, Alteza. Y el mío era conoceros. A ripple of surprise moved through the court. The Spanish princess had not only arrived with dignity, she had arrived armed with language, intellect, and presence. The symbolism of this union was not lost on the assembled ambassadors. With this marriage, the crowns of Castile and Aragon were tied to the vast dominions of the Habsburgs, Burgundy, Austria, and soon by inheritance swathes of Europe. The match had been orchestrated with cold precision, a manoeuvre in the great game of dynastic survival. Spain secured influence in the north while the Habsburgs gained a foothold in Iberia. Few could know that this union forged by reason of state would also unleash a passion whose consequences would echo for centuries in bloodlines and in whispers of madness. 2 days later, the great cathedral of St. Michael and St. Gudula in Brussels thundered with the solemnity of their vows. Beneath its soaring arches, before altars thick with incense and gold, Juana and Philip were bound together. Watching from the shadows, foreign envoys scribbled notes to their masters. Spain and Habsburg had become one. The balance of Europe had shifted, and no king or pope could ignore it. As bells rang out across the city, the people of Brussels celebrated with music, feasting, and dance. For them, it was not just a royal marriage, it was the promise of prosperity, of security under rulers blessed by both blood and God. But for Juana, standing beside the man who would shape both her fate and her ruin, the festivities blurred into a single bewildering truth: her life was no longer her own. She was a living treaty, a vessel of dynastic ambition, carrying in her body the fragile hope of 2 empires. And yet in the gaze of her new husband she sensed something neither treaty nor alliance could explain, an attraction that promised both ecstasy and peril. The bells of Brussels tolled until their echoes rolled like thunder across the low country fields. Within the soaring cathedral of St. Michael and St. Gudula, Juana and Philip were joined beneath vaults thick with incense and the eyes of all Europe. The archbishop's voice carried through the cavernous nave the Latin syllables of the marriage rite, binding not only 2 young royals but 2 empires. The ceremony was dazzling, a spectacle staged as much for politics as for piety. Rows of ambassadors recorded every gesture, knowing their monarchs awaited word of this new axis of power. The union of Trastamara and Habsburg would alter the balance of Europe, Castile and Aragon strong, in ships and silver now bound to the Burgundian inheritance, and to the rising influence of Austria. Isabel and Fernando had gambled their daughter's life to secure the future of Spain. Maximilian of Austria. Philip's father had done the same for his son. Neither had expected their pawns to rebel or to ignite. After the solemn vows, the cathedral erupted in music, trumpets, blaring choirs swelling. Courtiers showered the couple with acclamations. To the crowds, this was the pure language of dynastic triumph. But behind the gold-threaded veils and formal bows, another story was beginning to unfold. That night, when Juana and Philip withdrew from the pageantry into their chambers, the marriage ceased to be a treaty written in flesh. It became something combustible. Accounts from attendants whisper that what should have been a formal consummation coldly expected exploded instead into an urgency that startled even them. Philip, long accustomed to adoration, found in Juana not passive obedience but a fierce and consuming presence. And Juana, raised to view her body as a tool of politics, found herself swept into a current she had never anticipated. Jamás imaginé que mi esposa española tendría tanto fuego, Philip is said to have murmured, brushing her hair from her face, half amused, half overcome. Juana gave no reply. In her silence was calculation, but also surrender to a force she had not prepared for desire. This was the paradox of dynastic marriages. They were forged as ice, carefully negotiated, signed with solemn vows, and sealed with coinland and bloodlines. But sometimes the ice cracked and fire leapt forth. In Juana and Philip's union, passion struck like a spark in dry tinder. For a moment the treaties receded, and 2 young people, strangers hours earlier, collided with a force greater than statecraft. Yet even in this heat, Juana's mind did not entirely abandon its training. She understood, as her mother had drilled into her, that affection could be both a fortress and a weakness. Love could stabilize a throne or expose it to betrayal. Philip's charm, so irresistible to courtiers and people alike, was a double-edged sword. He was generous, light-hearted, magnetic. But he was also restless, drawn to pleasures, and easily swayed. Juana, forged in the severity of the Castilian court, could already feel the fault lines between them. Still, that first night remains one of history's ironies. A marriage arranged as a cold calculation of power was kindled into a private fire no ambassador had foreseen. For Juana, it was both triumph and trap. She had gained her husband's attention in a way few political brides ever managed. But she had also bound herself body and soul to a man whose heart wandered as quickly as it burned. Outside their chamber, the torches guttered in the night winds of Brussels. Inside, the future of Spain and Austria shifted course not on parchment, but in whispered words and embraces in the fire of a marriage that began as strategy and erupted into desire. Winter cloaked Brussels in a grey mantle, its chill seeping through the thick walls of Coudenberg Palace. Inside, the atmosphere was no less frigid. Juana, heavy with her first child, paced the length of her chamber like a caged animal. Her ladies urged her to rest, but the Queen-in-Waiting's eyes blazed with a fury that banished sleep. That morning word had reached her ears. Her husband, the radiant Philip the Handsome, had been seen again in the company of a Flemish merchant's daughter, his laughter too free, his hand lingering too long. For most royal consorts of the age, such news would have been swallowed with resignation. In courts from England to France, noblewomen were expected to endure their husbands' dalliances in silence. A prince's bed was considered a political stage, his lovers mere ornaments in the tapestry of power. A wife's role was to bear heirs, keep her dignity, and never let jealousy spill into the corridors where ambassadors walked. But Juana was no meek ornament. She had been raised in the austere Castilian court of Isabel, where fidelity was demanded of men and women alike, where marriage was as much about moral order as about politics. To her, Philip's betrayal was not only an affront to her dignity, but an insult to the dynasty she carried in her womb. When Philip returned late to their chamber, his hair scented faintly of wine and perfume, he found his wife waiting. Her face, usually composed, was transformed by rage. "Os habéis divertido, mi señor?" she asked, her voice calm but edged like steel. Philip, startled by her boldness, tried to brush it aside. "No sé a qué os referís, doña Juana." But Juana would not be dismissed. "A vuestra amante," she shot back, "la hija del mercader de paños, la que visitáis mientras yo llevo en mi vientre a vuestro heredero." The young archduke stiffened. No woman, least of all a wife, had ever dared confront him so directly. His charm, so effortless in public, faltered under the weight of her fury. "Sois mi esposa y la madre de mi heredero," he replied coldly. "Ese es vuestro lugar. No os corresponde cuestionar mis actividades." But Juana straightened even with the burden of her pregnancy and answered, with the fire that so unsettled his court, "Soy infanta de Castilla y Aragón, antes que vuestra esposa, hija de reyes que gobiernan por derecho propio, no por matrimonio. No confundáis mi posición, Felipe." The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the echoes of their quarrel. Servants huddled outside the chamber, wide-eyed at the raised voices. Never had the court of Burgundy seen such a scene. The Spanish princess, supposed to be pliant, gracious, and silent, was shouting at their beloved duke as though she wore the crown herself. In whispered corners, nobles muttered about her immoderate temper. "La Española tiene un carácter impropio," remarked the Count of Nassau. "Actúa como si fuese ella quien llevara la corona." His companion smirked and replied, "Son los españoles, fanáticos y apasionados. Demasiada sangre mora en sus venas." To them, Juana's refusal to tolerate infidelity was not dignity but madness, not strength but dangerous excess. What they could not see was the deeper injustice. Men like Philip were celebrated for their virility, their mistresses paraded almost as trophies. Women like Juana, however, were condemned if they showed even a flicker of jealousy. A prince's betrayal was his right, a princess's anger was her flaw. The double standard was as old as the dynasties themselves, and Juana found herself crushed beneath its weight. Still, she would not yield. Her confrontation with Philip was not merely a marital dispute, it was a declaration. She would not be a silent queen watching as her husband squandered dignity while she bore the burdens of lineage. Yet in her defiance she gave her enemies the very weapon they would later wield against her, the accusation that her passions made her unfit to rule. That night the palace settled uneasily into silence, but the echoes of their quarrel lingered in the corridors, in the whispers of courtiers and the reports that would soon travel back to Castile. For Juana, the fire of her love had turned into something darker, suspicion, jealousy, and the creeping shadow of a reputation that would haunt her for the rest of her life. If you enjoyed this moment, leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you're still here with me. In the cold Flemish winter of 1498, the Palace of Coudenberg was filled not with laughter, but with the tense murmurs of courtiers waiting outside a chamber, heavy with the scent of burning wax. Behind the doors Juana laboured for hours. At last her cries subsided into the thin, urgent wail of a newborn. A daughter. She was named Leonor after Juana's grandmother. Philip, radiant and flushed with pride, lifted the child for the first time. For a brief moment the quarrels, the betrayals, the tension dissolved in paternal joy. Juana, exhausted yet lucid, cradled her daughter with a tenderness that startled those who had only seen her fierce temper. Here was a mother, not a queen, whispering promises of protection in a tongue the infant could not yet know. Yet beneath this tenderness stirred storms that would not remain hidden. Juana's love for Philip, already intense, had grown almost unbearable in its sharpness during her pregnancy. When he was near, she glowed with joy. When he left her side even for hours, she fell into spells of anguish that frightened her attendants. Some days she refused food, pale and trembling, until Philip returned. Other days she lashed out in jealous suspicion, convinced that every absence concealed another betrayal. The Spanish ambassador Juan Manuel, sharp-eyed and cautious, observed this pattern with increasing alarm. In a confidential report to Ferdinand and Isabel, he described Juana as a woman consumed by a love excessivo rayano and lo obsessivo. Her emotions, he warned, swung with dangerous extremes, elation one moment, despair the next. Such instability, he suggested, might threaten her ability to command respect in a court already hostile to her severity. Isabel received these reports in Castile with a heaviness she did not easily show. To the world she was the resolute queen mistress of a vast and growing kingdom. But in private, as her eyes moved across the ambassador's careful script, her heart constricted. For she recognized in Juana's behaviour an echo of someone she had known too well, her own mother, Queen Isabel of Portugal. The elder queen had spent her final years in the castle of Arevalo, sunk into what courtiers called melancholia. Curtains drawn, eyes clouded, she had wandered through rooms like a ghost haunted by visions and silences. Isabel had never forgotten the sorrow of that household. The whispering attendants, the sense of dread that clung to her childhood. Now she feared that same affliction was passing through the bloodline into her daughter. Fernando tried to soothe her fears. Perhaps it is only the strain of pregnancy or the cold of that foreign court. Juana is strong as you are. But Isabel was not easily consoled. She knew that strength and fragility often lived side by side. She herself had ruled with iron will, yet she had seen how swiftly the mind could unravel under grief and pressure. If Juana's passion could not be tempered, it might become the very chain that bound her. The irony was cruel. The union with Philip had been intended to secure the future of Castile and Aragon, to extend their dynasty into the heart of Europe. And now with the birth of Leonor, that future was embodied in flesh, a tiny girl swaddled in sagsipn, heir and hostage of dynastic ambition. But behind the celebration of her birth lay a deeper unease, that in Juana's body and mind the great strength of two dynasties had been mingled with their hidden weaknesses. In the months that followed, Brussels rang with both admiration and gossip. Some praised Juana as a devoted mother, her devotion to Philip proof of loyalty beyond measure. Others whispered that such devotion was dangerous, that a queen who could not control her heart could not hope to control a kingdom. Letters crossed the Pyrenees, each bearing fragments of truth and exaggeration, until in Spain a picture began to form. Juana was brilliant, beautiful, passionate, and possibly unstable. Isabel read, prayed, and remembered her mother's darkened rooms in Arevalo. She prayed the shadow would pass her daughter by. But history does not release its grip so easily, and what seemed at first only the turbulence of youth began to look like the first cracks in a foundation that would one day bear the weight of empires. The wheel of destiny turned swiftly in those years, as if God himself were rearranging the board on which Europe's dynasties played. Between 1497 and 1500, the House of Trastamara was struck by a series of blows so sudden, so devastating, that the fate of Spain shifted almost overnight, and with it, the fate of Juana. First came the death of her brother Prince Juan, the only son of Ferdinand and Isabel. He had been the golden child groomed since birth, to inherit both Castile and Aragon, the living proof that the union of two crowns would endure. Handsome, studious and beloved, he embodied his parents' hopes. But at just 19, newly married to Margaret of Austria, he fell ill with fever in Salamanca. Within days, the bright promise of his life guttered out. The chroniclers record Isabel's grief as inconsolable. Dios nos ha puesto a prueba llevándose a nuestro amado hijo. The queen had lost not just a son, but the linchpin of her dynastic project. Juana, in faraway Brussels, received the news with disbelief. Her brother, the prince whose very existence had kept her future at a comfortable distance from the throne, was gone. The succession now passed to her elder sister Isabel, Princess of Asturias. But tragedy does not strike only once. In 1498, the Princess Isabel, then married to Manuel III of Portugal, died giving birth to her son, the infant Miguel. The grief of the Spanish court deepened, but hope still clung to the child. Miguel was proclaimed heir to Castile, Aragon and Portugal. If he lived, 3 crowns would unite in his tiny hands, and Iberia itself might have been bound together under one monarch. He did not live. In 1500, before reaching his 2nd birthday, Miguel died. The Triple Crown dissolved in an instant, and with it the dream of an Iberian union. And so the impossible became reality. Juana, once the overlooked daughter, was now heir to the mightiest realms of the West. Castile-Leon, Aragon-Granada. The kingdoms united under her parents suddenly awaited her. And not only Spain. Her marriage to Philip connected her to the Burgundian inheritance, and through his father Maximilian to Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. The map of Europe seemed to bend toward her womb. That same year, Juana gave birth to a son. They named him Carlos in honour of his Habsburg grandfather. He was born amid letters still damp with the ink that announced Miguel's death. Courtiers whispered that destiny itself had shifted as Juana bled in childbed and her son drew his first breath. Here was a boy who might inherit Spain, Burgundy, Austria, perhaps even the empire. The birth of Carlos was not just a family event, it was a geopolitical earthquake. Philip cradled the infant with eyes that glittered not only with paternal pride but with ambition. Este niño podría heredar más que ningún príncipe de la cristiandad, he mused. To him, Juana's sudden elevation was not merely fortune, it was a coronation in waiting. For Juana, exhausted and aching, the moment was more complex. She looked upon her son with love, yes, but also with a shadow of premonition. Mas tierras significan más enemigos, she murmured to one of her attendants. Espero que tenga la fortaleza para soportar tal carga. In Spain, the news of Miguel's death and Carlos's birth reached Isabel and Ferdinand with mixed emotions. Relief that their lineage continued sorrow, that the future rested on the shoulders of a daughter whose temperament already troubled them. Isabel's heart, already bruised by grief, now bore the weight of doubt. Could Juana, with her passions and tempests, govern the vast inheritance that was coming to her? In those 3 short years, the order of succession had been overturned by death after death, and in the eyes of Europe, Juana had transformed from a secondary princess into the axis around which the future revolved. The fragile girl who once argued too fiercely with her tutors now carried within her the destiny of kingdoms. And though no one could yet see the full cost, the crown that was drawing nearer was heavy enough to bend even the strongest neck. The year was 1502, and Spain waited with bated breath. For the first time since her marriage, Juana returned to the land of her birth, not as a forgotten daughter, but as the future queen. Alongside Philip, she travelled across France in a procession that drew crowds eager to glimpse the young couple. Everywhere they went, receptions sparkled with pageantry, triumphal arches, tapestries unfurled, choirs, thundering hymns. Each display signalled recognition of the immense inheritance that now awaited them. When they entered Castile, the ceremonies grew even grander. In Toledo and later in Valladolid, the Cortes assembled to swear allegiance to Juana and Philip as the legitimate heirs of Isabel and Ferdinand. Noble clergy and townsmen all gathered, their voices rising in acclamation. Castilla y Aragon reconocen a sus príncipes. For the people it was the promise of continuity, the reassurance that the hard-won unity of the crowns would endure. But beneath the glitter of banners and the solemnity of oaths lay an undercurrent of unease. For many it was not Philip who drew their scrutiny, but Juana herself. The princess walked with the dignity of a queen, her gestures precise, her Latin fluent in formal address, and yet in her eyes flickered something restless, a spark that unsettled those who looked too closely. Queen Isabel, observing her daughter for the first time in years, felt a pang deeper than pride. She saw the grace, the composure, the brilliance she had nurtured. But she also saw something else, the vehemence that had once burned in the schoolroom, now sharpened by the marriage and passion. Reports from Flanders had already reached her whispers of jealous rages of tears when Philip strayed of melancholy when he departed. Now face to face Isabel could not dismiss them as exaggerations. She saw in Juana's gaze an intensity that bordered on fever. That evening after the formal ceremonies, mother and daughter spoke alone in a chamber lit by a single lamp. Isabel's voice was steady, though her heart trembled. El peso que ahora recae sobre tus hombros es inmenso, she told her daughter. No es solo un privilegio, hija mía. Es un deber sagrado que consume cada hora, cada pensamiento. Juana, proud and defiant, met her mother's eyes. He sido educada para ello, madre, como vos me enseñasteis. Her tone carried conviction, but also impatience, as though she wished to sweep aside doubts with words alone. Isabel clasped her daughter's hands. El gobierno requiere claridad de mente y dominio de las pasiones. He oído informes de tus arrebatos de celos que no corresponden a una futura reina. Juana stiffened. ¿Quién osa calumniarme? Los mismos cortesanos que celebran las infidelidades de mi esposo. Si soy celosa, es porque no acepto lo que otras mujeres toleran en silencio. There was silence between them, the weight of generations pressing in. Isabel remembered her own mother's decline, the melancholy that had darkened Arevalo. She saw the same shadow flicker in Juana and it chilled her. But she also knew that to accuse her daughter directly would be to wound her pride, perhaps to drive her further into defiance. At last Isabel sighed, her voice softer, almost weary. Reza por fortaleza, hija mía. La necesitarás tanto para gobernar como para soportar las pruebas personales que Dios te envíe. Juana said nothing, her face a mask of composure, but inside her conflicting storms raged love for her mother, irritation at her doubts, and a flicker of dread she would never name aloud. For Isabel, the moment was bitter. She had built her reign on discipline, on the ability to master her own passions for the sake of a kingdom. She could only pray her daughter might learn to do the same. Yet in her heart she feared that prayer would go unanswered. The oath sworn in 1502 secured Juana and Philip as heirs of Spain. But for Isabel, the ceremony was not reassurance, it was foreshadowing. She had given her daughter both crown and warning. Whether Juana could bear them both would soon become the tragedy of an age. Medina del Campo, November of 1504. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and damp earth. The town subdued beneath the knowledge that its queen was dying. Within the fortress of La Mota, Isabel of Castile lay pale and wasted after months of illness. The woman who had led armies, expelled invaders, and united a kingdom now struggled for breath in a chamber dimly lit by flickering candles. Priests murmured prayers, courtiers wept quietly in corners, and Fernando, her husband, and fellow monarch stood silent with eyes lowered. Isabel, even in her weakness, was resolute. Her voice, faint but steady, dictated her last will to the royal secretary. Her words carried the weight not only of law but of destiny. Y nombro como mi legítima sucesora en los reinos de Castilla, León y Granada a mi hija Doña Juana, she declared. The courtiers leaned forward, the scribes pressed their quills harder into the parchment. A queen who had reigned with iron discipline was passing her crown to her daughter. But then came the pause, the hesitation that would change history. Isabel added a clause spoken slowly, as though carving the future with her lips. Y en caso de que ésta no pueda o no quiera gobernar, que mi esposo don Fernando actúe como regente hasta que mi nieto Carlos alcance la mayoría de edad. The words seemed routine, a safeguard, but they were more than that. They were a seed planted in the soil of doubt that would one day grow into Juana's prison. Isabel had heard the reports, the jealous rages in Brussels, the melancholies when Philip strayed the rumours of imbalance. She loved her daughter fiercely, but she feared for her, feared for Spain. And so she created the legal mechanism by which Juana might be set aside should her temperament prove ungovernable. As the ink dried, the fate of her daughter began to harden like iron. What Isabel intended as caution became a weapon in the hands of those who saw advantage in sidelining Juana, her husband Philip, her father Fernando, and later her son Carlos. On November 26th, at the age of 53, Isabel of Castile breathed her last. The bells tolled deep and sonorous, rolling across the towns and fields of Castile. People knelt in the streets, women tore their veils, men raised torches in mourning. Chroniclers compared her death to an eclipse, a sudden darkness falling over the land. Her funeral was staged with a solemnity befitting the queen who had remade Spain. Draped in black velvet, her coffin was borne slowly from Medina del Campo to Granada, the city she had chosen as her final resting place beside Ferdinand one day, and forever close to the tombs of the Catholic monarch's ancestors. The cortege moved through villages where peasants wept openly, for Isabel was not just a sovereign, she was a symbol of divine order, the mother of their united realm. At every stop, churches thundered with requiems, incense clouded the air, and our nobles bowed their heads not only in grief but in calculation. For with Isabel gone, the equilibrium of Spain was broken. Juana was queen now in name, and by right, but in the shadows her inheritance trembled. Fernando, outwardly the grieving widower, inwardly clutched the power Isabel had placed within reach. Philip, impatient and ambitious, prepared to claim his share of sovereignty through his wife, and Juana, far away in Flanders, received the news wrapped in mourning clothes and dread. At just 25 she had become Queen of Castile, Leon and Granada. But the crown that descended upon her was not a crown of triumph, it was a crown laced with suspicion, bound by the claws her mother had left behind. Thus ended Isabel's reign in glory and grief, and thus began Juana's shadowed before it even started. One queen had united Spain. The next would spend her life proving in vain that she was not unfit to rule it. The winter of 1506 lashed the northern seas with merciless fury. Juana and Philip, eager to claim the Castilian throne after Isabel's death, embarked for Spain with a fleet meant to carry them swiftly to power. Instead, they were met by storms so violent that sailors swore angels and demons battled in the skies above. Winds howled, sails tore, and ships scattered. The royal vessel itself, battered by waves, drifted off course and found refuge, not in Castile, but on the cold shores of England. Thus fate placed the young queen and her ambitious husband in the hands of Henry VII. For weeks they remained guests of the English king-guests, whose freedom was carefully measured in coin and diplomacy. Henry saw in their misfortune an opportunity trade agreements could be extracted. Favours compelled, leverage gained. Philip, restless and seething at the humiliation, signed a treaty with England without even consulting his wife. It was the first of many times he would act not with Juana, but over her. When at last they reached Spain in April, the mood was anything but celebratory. Fernando, widower of Isabel, but still master of Aragon, had taken the reins of Castile as regent. He greeted his daughter and son-in-law in Valladolid, but his embrace was cold, his gaze sharp. He had spent decades playing the chessboard of Europe, and he saw in Philip not an ally, but a rival, an interloper, eager to snatch the inheritance Isabel had left to their bloodline. "Bienvenida a casa, hija mía," Fernando said, taking Juana's hand with the tenderness of a father. Yet his eyes never left Philip, who stepped forward with rehearsed courtesy. "Castilla os recibe con ansia." Philip declared, his voice smooth, his smile calculated. "Y a su rey consorte." Fernando arched a brow. "En Castilla el poder corresponde a la reina por derecho propio. Los consortes no gobiernan." His words were ice. It was a warning Philip chose not to heed. Supported by a faction of Castilian nobles, weary of Fernando's stern rule, he began plotting to sideline his wife. The reports of Juana's jealousies, her erratic griefs, her intensity whispers that had circulated for years were now gathered into a single weapon. Philip spread the claim that Juana, though queen by blood, lacked the judgment to govern. In court sessions he spoke with a feigned concern that fooled no one. "La reina mi esposa sufre de melancolía y debilidad de juicio," he told the procurators of Castile. "Por amor a ella y por amor al reino debo asumir las riendas del gobierno." For Fernando this was both infuriating and familiar. He himself had used the same whispers of instability to justify caution in Isabel's will. Yet he had never intended to surrender Castile to a foreigner. The clash was inevitable, two seasoned political players, one old and hardened the other, young and ambitious, circling each other, like predators over the body of Spain. And in the middle stood Juana Queen, by right pawn by circumstance. When she attempted to speak to assert her authority, her words were dismissed as evidence of frenzy. When she remained silent, her silence was twisted into proof of incapacity. She was trapped in a paradox. Anything she did or did not do became justification to strip her of power. Nobles divided, alliances shifted, rumours spread. The court became a battlefield of whispers and signatures. Juana, caught between her father's iron grip and her husband's ambition, found her own voice drowned out. What neither Fernando nor Philip admitted, perhaps even to themselves, was that both sought not Juana's well-being but her throne. The struggle for Castile had begun, and the Queen herself was the prize. In the spring of 1506, the corridors of Castile's palaces buzzed not with the certainty of a queen's reign, but with the murmurs of doubt carefully sown by her husband. Philip, once the charming foreign consort, now moved with the confidence of a ruler. He convened councils without summoning his wife, met ambassadors in chambers she was barred from entering, and signed documents in his own name as if her crown had been placed directly upon his brow. Juana, rightful queen by inheritance, soon found herself isolated in her own kingdom. Guards loyal to Philip began to restrict her access to courtiers. Letters she attempted to send were intercepted. Allies who tried to reach her were quietly turned away. The strategy was clear: surround the queen with silence until her authority withered. But Juana did not yield easily. When presented with decrees for her signature grants of office lands bestowed on Philip's Flemish favourites, she resisted. Quiero leer los primero, she demanded. And when the terms insulted the traditions her mother had defended, she simply refused to sign. To Juana it was not madness, but duty. To Philip it was the perfect evidence he needed. «Veis como insiste en cuestiones impropias de su condición», Philip told the councillors with a rehearsed sigh. «Una reina sensata confiaría en el juicio de sus asesores». Her refusal to blindly endorse his will became the very proof he brandished of her instability. It was a cruel paradox. If Juana asserted her authority, her passion was branded hysteria. If she withheld it, her silence was called melancholia. To resist was madness. To submit was to vanish. Every act, every hesitation, every tear was woven into the narrative of a queen who could not govern. In the great halls the whisper spread, «La reina no está bien». Courtiers who had once admired her intellect now looked upon her with suspicion, shaking their heads with pity or contempt. Some pitied her as a woman trapped between a father and a husband who sought to use her crown. Others saw in her behaviour an uncomfortable challenge to the world's order, a queen who spoke and acted like a king, but was judged doubly for it. Philip, meanwhile, consolidated his hold. He had the nobility's support. Many resented Fernando's return and preferred a pliant foreign prince to the stern hand of the old Aragonese king. With their backing, he moved swiftly to sideline Juana entirely. By the summer, he openly presented himself as sole ruler, speaking of his wife as one beloved, but unfit a flower, too delicate for the weight of governance. Juana, increasingly confined, railed against the injustice. Some nights she wept, other nights she shouted her words, echoing through corridors where servants listened in silence. Those cries too became ammunition-proof to some that the queen was loca, when in truth they were the desperate cries of a sovereign watching her authority stripped away piece by piece. Her tragedy in this moment was not madness, it was clarity. She saw exactly what was being done to her, but in resisting she handed her enemies the very rope with which they bound her. She had inherited a kingdom yet was treated as a prisoner, and every protest became another line in the indictment of her supposed unfitness to reign. Thus in 1506, Juana of Castile, crowned by blood and law, was already a usurped queen, alive, lucid, but encircled by a narrative that history itself would struggle to untangle. Burgos, September 1506. The summer's suffocating heat was beginning to loosen its grip, yet inside the palace of the constable the air felt heavy and close, as though death itself lingered in every room. Philip the Handsome, not yet 28, lay stricken with a violent fever. Some said it came after he drank too much chilled water following a game of pelota. Others whispered of poison, of plots by nobles, or even by his father-in-law Fernando. Whatever the cause, the young king's body wasted quickly, and the courtiers watched with dread as the brilliance of his youth flickered away. Juana refused to leave his side. She sat at the edge of his bed, her eyes hollow, from sleeplessness, her hand gripping his as though sheer force might tether him to life. «No puedes abandonarme," she whispered. bending close to his ear. Te lo prohibo, Felipe. ¿Me oyes? No te permito que me dejes. Her words were not commands to a kingdom, but to the man she had bound herself to with a love both fierce and consuming. When at last he breathed his last on September 25th, the palace fell into silence. The courtiers exchanged uneasy glances. A king had died, and with him the fragile balance of Castile's future. But Juana did not weep like a widow resigned. She clung to his body, refusing to acknowledge the finality of death. Her grief was so raw, so obsessive that those who watched were unsettled. To them it looked less like mourning than madness. The body was embalmed, and yet Juana refused burial. She ordered that Philip remain with her, as though his presence in flesh could keep her world intact. She spent hours beside the coffin speaking to him, stroking the polished wood as though it were still warm skin. Servants whispered that at night she leaned close, whispering words of intimacy as if he still heard her. Then came the strangest chapter of all the funeral procession. Juana commanded that the coffin be taken from Burgos to Granada, the place Philip had wished to be buried. But she decreed that the cortege should move only by night. By day the coffin must be hidden, shielded from curious eyes, especially from women. Todas lo deseaban en vida, she explained, her voice trembling with possessive fire. Porque habría de ser diferente en la muerte. And so under the pale light of the moon the strange caravan wound its way across Castile. Monks, guards and servants trudged silently beside a bier that carried not just a dead man, but the unravelling grief of a queen. Villagers who saw the eerie sight crossed themselves, whispering tales of witchcraft of a queen bewitched by love or madness. The journey became slower and more erratic, halting at monasteries where Juana sometimes burst in unannounced to ensure no woman had drawn too near the coffin. One night, when a novice was caught staring too long at the bier, Juana accused her of desiring Philip even in death. Fear spread through the escort, and many muttered that they were trapped in a macabre pilgrimage without end. What Juana endured in those months was more than grief. It was a collapse of the fragile scaffolding that had held her life together. She had been betrayed by courtiers, usurped by her husband, doubted by her parents. And now, with Philip's death, she faced both abandonment and captivity. Her obsessive refusal to let go was not simply love, it was terror. For to bury Philip was to bury the last thread that tied her to power, to her role as queen, to her very sense of self. To the court it was proof that she had lost her reason. To history it became legend. The queen who wandered by night with her husband's corpse, a spectre of love twisted into madness. In truth, it was something more human and far more tragic, a woman consumed by grief, desperate to hold on to the one bond that had defined and destroyed her. And in her anguish she gave her enemies the perfect story to write her out of power. When word of Philip's sudden death reached Fernando, in Aragon, the old king moved quickly. To courtiers and chroniclers he played the part of grieving father-in-law returning to Castile to stabilize a kingdom shaken by tragedy. But beneath the mask of sorrow lay calculation. Isabel had left him a clause, a loophole carved into her will. If Juana could not or would not govern, Fernando could act as regent. Now with his son-in-law gone and his daughter adrift in a storm of grief, Fernando saw his moment. He found Juana in Burgos, pale and exhausted, still clinging to Philip's coffin. Her eyes burned with feverish devotion, her voice breaking as she spoke to her dead husband, as though he might answer. To Fernando it was all the justification he needed. Mi hija no está en estado de gobernar, he told the nobles. Por su propio bien y el de Castilla debo tomar las riendas. From that moment Juana's sovereignty began to shrink into the shadow of confinement. Fernando ordered her removed to the royal palace of Tordesillas, a fortress-like residence on the banks of the Duero. There he promised she would have peace, security, and the time to recover from her anguish. In reality, it was a prison. The mechanics of her captivity were carefully designed. Guards loyal not to the Queen but to Fernando patrolled the halls. Her correspondence was intercepted. Her visitors screened her movements, restricted. Even her spiritual life was manipulated, confessors and chaplains chosen not for their piety, but for their loyalty to the regent. Juana, though Queen of Castile by right now, lived under constant surveillance, her every word and gesture filtered into reports for her father. And always just beyond her chamber lay the coffin of Philip. Fernando allowed it to remain nearby, a concession that seemed merciful, but was in truth another chain. To courtiers, her habit of visiting the coffin became the clearest symbol of her supposed madness. La reina pasa horas hablando con el muerto, one report noted. No puede distinguir entre el mundo de los vivos y el de los difuntos. What it did not record was the context a widow isolated, stripped of power, her grief magnified by loneliness until it consumed her. The narrative of madness spread like wildfire. To the people, Juana became La Loca, the mad queen who whispered as to a corpse. To the nobles, her instability justified Fernando's regency. And to foreign courts, her incapacity was a convenient fiction, one that ensured negotiations with Spain could proceed without the unpredictability of a woman's rule. Yet beneath this cultivated image, Juana still resisted. She petitioned for access to her councils, demanded to read decrees before approving them, and complained bitterly about the restrictions placed upon her. Each act of defiance, however, was twisted into further proof of insanity. If she raged, it was madness. If she wept, it was madness. If she protested, it was madness. Thus Tordesillas became not just a prison of stone, but of narrative. Juana was confined in flesh and in story, her identity reduced to a legend, useful to others' ambitions. Her mother had given her a crown, her father had taken it away, and now she lived in a twilight where power was a memory and freedom a rumour. The woman who had once argued with her tutors beneath Castile's sun now sat in a dim chamber by the Duero, her kingdom governed in her name but without her hand. And outside her window the river flowed endlessly on, carrying away the years that would become her life sentence. While Juana languished in Tordesillas, surrounded by silence and suspicion, her son Carlos grew up an ocean of distance away in the rich courts of Flanders. He was not raised in the shadow of his mother's captivity, but in the glow of Habsburg ambition, guided by his formidable Aunt Margaret of Austria. Margaret herself, a widow twice over before the age of 24, carried a grave dignity that impressed itself upon the boy. She took her guardianship seriously, ensuring that Carlos was shaped not as a provincial prince of Castile, but as a ruler destined for an empire of many tongues and nations. Tutors from across Europe surrounded him. He learned Latin, French, Flemish, and later Castilian, though his tongue stumbled on its consonants. His mind was filled with the maps of a world expanding across oceans, with tales of New World gold and Ottoman power pressing at Europe's edges. In these years, the young prince's features began to show the unmistakable stamp of his lineage. Courtiers noted with pride the heavy jaw, the protruding lower lip, the beginnings of what would become known as the Habsburg jaw. To them it was not a deformity, but a badge of distinction, proof of noble blood and dynastic continuity. They praised what later generations would recognize as the visible mark of generations of intermarriage, a foreshadowing of the genetic trap into which the dynasty had wandered. For the boy himself, these early impressions were formative. He was taught to see his body, his very bones, as the embodiment of history. Each feature carried meaning, every gesture the weight of destiny. Where his mother had been accused of fire and excess, Carlos was schooled in discipline and silence. He learned to mask his feelings, to let restraint be his weapon. The Flemish courtiers admired his gravity, but in Spain this reserve would later be mistaken for coldness. The cultural contrast was stark. In the Low Countries he was surrounded by the wealth of merchant guilds, the bustling ports of Antwerp, the brightly coloured pageantry of northern courts. Banquets groaned with meat and butter. The air was heavy with incense and wool, and music spilled from guild halls into the cobbled streets. Castile, by contrast, was a land of austere monasteries, sober courtiers, and the lean diet of Reconquista warriors. Carlos's upbringing in Flanders gave him breadth of empire, but not the intimacy of Castilian life. When he finally returned, Spain would seem to him both his inheritance and a foreign land. Meanwhile in Tordesillas, Juana asked for news of her children, and received only fragments. Letters from her daughters filtered through the sieve of her keepers. Reports of Carlos's growth reached her only in whispers. She was told of his health, his studies, his piety, but never allowed to shape him with her own voice. He was her son by blood, yet to him she became little more than a name, a figure shrouded in rumour. Thus the lines of history stretched in two directions, a mother confined in silence and a son educated for a throne she could not touch. And already in the tilt of his jaw and the silence of his manner, the seeds of both empire and curse were beginning to show. Autumn 1517. A chill wind swept across the fields of Castile as a fleet arrived on the northern coast. Among its passengers was a 17-year-old youth, pale of skin, narrow of frame, his lower jaw already pushing forward with the unmistakable stamp of his dynasty. This was Carlos of Habsburg, grandson of the Catholic monarch's son of Juana and Philip, now king, in name of both Castile and Aragon. Yet though his titles were heavy, his steps into Spain were uncertain. He had never set foot on this land before, and he barely spoke its language. One of his first duties was to meet the woman whose blood had given him the crown. For all his schooling in Flanders, Carlos had never known his mother. The stories had reached him, of course, tales of a queen locked away for her own safety, her mind broken by grief, her heart enslaved to the corpse of a husband long dead. He had been told to respect her, to pity her, but not to trust her judgment. In November he rode to Tordesillas, the fortress palace, where Juana had already endured more than a decade of confinement. The halls were dim, the air heavy with incense meant to disguise the dampness of stone. Guards shifted uneasily as the young king passed their presence, a reminder that this was no royal residence but a carefully maintained prison. Juana waited in a sparsely lit chamber overlooking the Duero. She was 38 now, still bearing traces of the beauty that had once captivated Philip, but time and isolation had left their shadows in her eyes. When Carlos entered, she studied him silently, her gaze moving over his face as though searching for someone else. Finally, she murmured almost to herself, "Tiene la mandíbula de su abuelo Maximiliano." It was not the greeting of a mother to a son, but an observation sharp and unsettling about the bone structure that marked his bloodline. Carlos bowed stiffly. "He venido a presentaros mis respetos, señora," he said in careful Castilian, "y a informaros de que he asumido el gobierno de vuestros reinos según dispuso mi abuelo Fernando." Juana's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Mis reinos? Qué curioso que todos los llamen míos mientras me mantienen prisionera." The words hung in the air, heavier than any ceremonial greeting. For a moment the young king faltered. Here was no raving madwoman, but a queen fully aware of her captivity. Her lucidity, her bitterness pierced the careful veil that had been spun around her name. Carlos recovered quickly, masking his unease. "No estáis prisionera, madre. Estáis aquí por vuestra seguridad, por vuestro bienestar." Her reply was swift, her voice cutting. "También me dirás que estoy loca." "Tu padre lo dijo. Tu abuelo también. ¿Es esa la lección que te enseñaron?" The silence that followed was suffocating. For all his imperial training, Carlos had no answer to this. He could not deny her sanity without risking his own legitimacy, for if Juana were truly capable of ruling, then he was merely the usurper of his mother's throne. Yet he could not acknowledge her clarity either, for that would unravel the very foundation of his power. And so he chose ambiguity. He left the chamber after only a brief audience, instructing the Marquis of Denia to maintain the strict regime of watchfulness. "La reina parece tener momentos de lucidez," he admitted privately, "pero son pasajeros. No puede gobernar." That single judgment sealed her fate for decades to come. Carlos had seen his mother not as mad, but as inconvenient. Her very sanity was a threat to his authority. And so her supposed madness became not just a family story, but a political necessity. Thus the son departed, leaving behind a woman who was both his mother and his rival, both lucid and silenced. Juana remained in Tordesillas, staring out over the grey river, while the boy she had birthed went on to become the ruler of an empire where the sun never set. She was queen in name, prisoner, in truth a mother, denied, a sovereign erased, yet a shadow he could never entirely escape. The year was 1520, and Castile was restless. The young King Carlos, scarcely 3 years on the throne, had filled offices with Flemish favourites and drained the kingdom's coffers to fund his imperial ambitions abroad. To the proud cities of Castile, this was not governance, but plunder. Discontent smouldered in Toledo, Segovia, Salamanca, and Valladolid, until at last the fire erupted into open rebellion. The Comuneros, as the rebels called themselves, declared that they did not rise against their queen, but for her. In their eyes, the rightful sovereign was not the foreign-born Carlos, but Juana, the daughter of Isabella Católica, still alive in her captivity at Tordesillas. If she could be restored, they argued Castile would return to its natural order. And so in a move that startled Europe, the Comuneros marched to the palace prison by the Duero. Guards were overwhelmed, and for the first time in nearly 15 years, Juana found herself face to face with subjects who begged her to reign. Juan de Padilla and other leaders knelt before her, presenting grievances against the king's Flemish ministers. They asked for her signature, her seal, her voice to legitimize their movement. What they found was not the madwoman of rumour. Juana listened intently, questioned carefully, and expressed sympathy for their cause. "Lamento el sufrimiento de mis vasallos," she said with dignity. The comuneros left that first audience convinced they had found their sovereign at last. One chronicler wrote in awe, "En ningún momento mostró señales de la locura que le atribuyen sus carceleros." But when the time came to act to place her name to the decrees that would authorize a new government, Juana hesitated. She looked at the petitions, at the faces around her, and then spoke words that stunned them. "Mi hijo puede haber cometido errores, pero sigue siendo mi sangre. No puedo condenar a Castilla a la guerra civil sin certeza de otra salida." It was a lucid, measured response, but one that the rebels could neither accept nor understand. To them, her caution was paralysis. To her captors, it was confirmation of her weakness. To later historians, it was the most tragic proof of all that Juana, far from insane, understood the cost of power better than those who sought to use her. Her refusal to fully endorse the Comuneros doomed their hopes. They moved their council to Tordesillas, declaring that documents would now be issued in her name and her son's together. But without her active signature, the legitimacy they craved remained fragile. When royalist troops counterattacked later that year, Juana was quickly returned to strict confinement, her brief flicker of political relevance extinguished. Yet the memory of those weeks lingered. For a moment Castile had glimpsed a queen who was neither mad nor broken, but cautious, lucid, and tragically trapped. Her restraint was her wisdom, but it became her prison, for in a world hungry for symbols, ambiguity was more dangerous than madness itself. Villalar, April 1521. The hopes of the Comuneros bled into the Castilian soil as Padilla Bravo and Maldonado were executed, their rebellion crushed beneath the weight of royalist arms. With their fall, Juana's fleeting moment as a symbol of hope evaporated. The woman the rebels had approached as sovereign was once again reduced to a captive. But this time her chains were heavier, less visible, yet more absolute. Carlos, now crowned emperor, understood what the revolt had revealed. His mother remained a dangerous banner. Even without her consent, her bloodline carried legitimacy that he could not afford to share, and so he ordered that the confinement at Tordesillas be redoubled. Guards were rotated constantly to prevent sympathy. Her household was reduced to those who reported faithfully to the crown. Her letters were confiscated. Her visitors screened, her voice smothered, before it could travel beyond the walls. The reports that reached the court painted a portrait of deterioration. Hoy la reina rasgó sus vestiduras y rechazó los alimentos, wrote the Marquis of Denia. Exige recibir embajadores y revisar decretos, cosa impropia de su condición. Another dispatch claimed ha pasado horas llorando y gritando por su difunto esposo. Se confirma que su juicio está perdido. But these so-called proofs of madness were in truth the ordinary cries of a woman stripped of freedom, agency, and companionship. Her anger was rebellion against captivity, her melancholy the natural grief of isolation. Yet in the logic of politics, every protest confirmed the fiction. If she resisted, it was hysteria. If she mourned, it was delusion. If she demanded dignity, it was obsession. The palace at Tordesillas became both her tomb and her stage. Servants watched her closely, recording every word. If she spoke lucidly, the reports omitted it. If she raged, those were the lines copied and sent to councils abroad. A legend was being constructed brick by brick out of the fragments of her humanity. And beyond those walls, the empire grew. Carlos travelled from Spain to Flanders, from Germany to Italy, gathering crowns until his dominion stretched across continents. Always he ruled in her name, decrees still bore Juana Reina Proprietaria, but never with her consent. To admit her sanity would unravel the foundations of his power. Her silence was the cornerstone of his empire. Thus the tragedy deepened, a queen alive but politically dead, her confinement both personal punishment and public necessity. The world came to know her as La Loca, yet the true madness lay in the system that needed her to be so. Behind the thick walls of Tordesillas, Juana's days blurred into years. She prayed, argued, wept, and sometimes laughed. She sang old songs that echoed through empty corridors, and each sound, each gesture was twisted into evidence of a mind unfit. Her very survival became her curse. The longer she lived, the longer the empire required her silence. The years slipped into decades, and Juana of Castile aged within walls that did not change. The palace of Tordesillas became a place where time slowed, where the seasons could be glimpsed only through a narrow window overlooking the Duero. Outside the empire, her name legitimized, expanded across oceans. its wealth feeding wars and palaces. Inside, the queen who had birthed it remained in a chamber more like a cell than a throne room. By the 1530s, Juana was in her 50s. Age had not broken her body, she retained a stubborn vitality, as though defying her captors by simply enduring. Her face bore the lines of grief, but her eyes could still flash with the sharpness of memory. Reports from the Marquis of Denia's household still spoke of fits of melancholy and bursts of fury, yet these were the inevitable outcries of a woman forced into a half-life. On rare occasions her son Carlos visited. By then he was Emperor-Master of Spain, Germany, Italy, the Low Countries, and the Americas. When he stood before her reserved and grave, Juana studied him with the cool detachment of one who recognized the inheritance he carried, not only in crown but in body. Tiene la mandíbula de los Austria. She observed her gaze lingering on his jaw. Y algo de los Trastámara en la mirada. It was a remark both chilling and intimate, a reminder that she could read in her children the history of nations. Her grandson Felipe also visited as a boy, and Juana looked at him long as though seeing not only a child, but the shadow of the dynasty's future. She pointed at his lip, at the line of his chin. Se parece a su abuelo Felipe, she murmured. Pero los ojos son de mi madre. To the attendants it seemed like rambling. To Carlos it was unsettling, a woman the world insisted was mad, yet who perceived with startling clarity the marks of ancestry and the weight of blood. For Juana, memory itself was both solace and cruelty. She remembered the gardens of her youth, the stern lessons of her mother, the passion and betrayal of Philip. These recollections sustained her, but they also mocked her, for they belonged to a life denied her now. She lived not in madness, but in shadow, excluded from the world, yet forced to carry every echo of it in her mind. Prison had not taken her titles. On parchment she remained La Reina Propietaria, sovereign of Castile, but in truth her existence had been reduced to ritual prayers. Whispered steps counted the daily drip of time. A living death, where her body endured but her voice was erased. For those who guarded her, she became an object, an inconvenient presence to be managed. For her son, she was both necessity and shame, the queen who must never be seen clearly for what she was. For herself, she was a woman who knew too well that history had locked her away, not because she was broken, but because she had never truly broken. In the 1550s, Juana entered her 70s, an age few reached in that era. Her hair silvered, her movements slowed, but her mind, when stirred, could still cut with unsettling precision. She had become a ghost haunting her own prison, a reminder of promises broken and crowns stolen. And still the Duero flowed beneath her window, carrying away the years she was denied. By the spring of 1555, the woman once crowned as Juana of Castile was 75 years old. Her body, astonishingly resilient after decades of confinement, had finally begun to yield. The winters of Tordesillas had gnawed at her lungs, and the endless damp stone had seeped into her bones. She was frail now, her hands trembling as she clutched rosary beads worn smooth by half a century of prayer. The queen who had once ridden across Flanders in crimson brocade was now a shadow wrapped in wool, her world reduced to the narrow chamber where she had lived her living death. Yet even in her decline her dignity lingered. When courtiers and confessors entered her room, they reported that she greeted them with calm courtesy, her words lucid and deliberate. She asked for news of her children and grandchildren, though she knew most of it would be filtered and false. She remembered details with startling clarity, birthdays, traits, even the tilt of a jaw inherited across generations. For those who had long cultivated her legend as La Loca, her composure in those final weeks was a silent rebuke. It was Francisco de Borja, once Duke of Gandia, and now a Jesuit, who attended her at the end. He had known her in youth before her captivity consumed her life, and the sight of her stirred both sorrow and reverence. In his letters he described her as a soul at peace with God, though betrayed by men. Su Alteza recibe los sacramentos con plena conciencia, he wrote. Ora con devoción su alma reconciliada con el cielo, sino con el mundo. The contrast was sharp, spiritually serene, politically broken. Juana had borne the weight of crowns without ever holding them. Her life had been the ransom for the ambitions of father, husband, and son. She had been branded mad, not because she lost her mind, but because she clung to her right to rule in a world unwilling to let her. On the night of April 12, 1555, Juana exhaled her last breath in the palace of Tordesillas, the same stone walls that had watched her youth fade into old age. After nearly 50 years of confinement, she died, not as the queen who reigned, but as the queen remembered only through whispers. Her body was laid to rest in Granada beside Philip the Handsome, the husband whose death had marked the beginning of her long tragedy. To her captors it was fitting husband and wife reunited in death. To history it was bitter irony, for it was Philip's betrayal and obsession that had begun the tale of Juana la Loca, in that dim chamber by the Duero. A woman's voice was silenced forever, but her story, half myth, half truth, was only beginning to echo through the centuries. Juana's death in 1555 might have closed her personal tragedy, but her shadow did not fade. It lived on in the blood of her descendants, her son Carlos of Spain, better known to history as the Emperor Charles V, had built a dominion where the sun never set, yet in his very body and in the marriages he arranged, the old seeds of fragility were taking root. In 1526 Charles had married his cousin Isabel of Portugal. To contemporaries it was a brilliant union. Castile and Aragon bound closer to Lisbon, Iberia, poised as one great power. But Isabel was also Juana's niece, the daughter of her sister Maria. Bloodlines already entangled folded in upon themselves again. Out of this union came Felipe, the heir who would rule as Philip II, King of Spain at its zenith, but also a carrier of the family's tightening inheritance. Philip followed the same pattern. He wed 4 times and twice to women of his own blood. First to Maria Manuela of Portugal, his cousin who gave him Don Carlos. Then to Mary Tudor of England, then Elizabeth of Valois, and finally Anne of Austria, his own niece. Each marriage was not the choice of affection, but of policy designed to keep realms locked within the Habsburg circle. And with each generation the gene pool narrowed further. The results were visible. Don Carlos, the son of Philip II and Maria Manuela, embodied both promise and peril. At birth he had been hailed as the future of the dynasty, but his body bore the marks of inbreeding. A twisted spine, a malformed skull, a jaw too large for speech or chewing. His mind was unstable, veering from brilliance to violence. He raged at servants, abused animals, plotted wild conspiracies. By his adolescence, whispers of madness echoed those once spoken of his grandmother Juana. To some he was proof that the curse of La Loca had passed to her grandson. To others, he was the inevitable outcome of marriages where kin begat kin. Even in Charles V himself the signs had not been absent. The Habsburg jaw that Juana had remarked upon in her son grew more pronounced, his teeth never quite meeting. By the time of his abdication in 1556, he was a man prematurely aged, tormented by gout so severe he could scarcely walk his body as much a battlefield as the empires he had ruled. Juana's legacy was thus doubled. She was the cornerstone of Europe's mightiest dynasty, the woman whose womb had given birth to kings and emperors. But she was also the silent omen of its fragility. Her confinement had been justified by tales of hereditary weakness, of female instability, of inherited melancholy. Ironically, those fears twisted into political weapons against her became self-fulfilling across the generations. For as the 16th century advanced, the Spanish Habsburgs seemed ever more like prisoners of their own blood. Their bodies, like Juana's fate, were testimonies to the cruel cost of dynastic ambition, power secured not by freedom, but by chains, invisible chains forged in marriage contracts and bloodlines folded back upon themselves in children born to carry both crowns and curses. And all of it began with the girl born in Toledo in 1479, whose fire had been silenced, but whose blood continued to speak in the most unsettling ways. Madrid, November 1700. The Alcazar of the Spanish kings lay in silence as its sovereign slipped toward death. Carlos II, the last male heir of the Spanish Habsburg line, was only 38, but his body had long carried the weight of centuries of dynastic obsession. To his subjects he was El Hechizado, the bewitched king, so feeble and malformed that many believed sorcery, not sicknesses, explained his state. Contemporaries described a pitiful figure, short and frail, his jaw grotesquely extended so that he could barely chew his speech, slurred, his tongue too large for his mouth. His eyes bulged, his body trembled with seizures, his frame was bent with rickets. He had been married twice, yet never sired a child. The line that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries ended with a king incapable of fathering an heir. Physicians and priests hovered anxiously offering charms and prayers, but no remedy could undo the centuries of bloodlines folded upon themselves. Modern geneticists examining the Habsburg family tree have confirmed what contemporaries only sensed Carlos V's inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born to siblings. Juana of Castile and Philip the Handsome appear in his ancestry by no fewer than 8 different lines. The dynasty had knotted itself into genetic collapse. The king's autopsy preserved in chilling reports revealed more than rumour ever could. His body was emaciated, his heart shriveled, his intestines blackened and ulcerated. He had only one atrophied testicle, and his skull contained fluid that suggested hydrocephalus. To those who saw the corpse, it was as though the dynasty's centuries of power had left behind not majesty but ruin. And yet Carlos II's tragedy was not his alone. It was the final act of a story that began with Juana. The union that brought together Castile and the Habsburgs created the most powerful empire of its time, but it also created a chain of marriages designed to keep power within the family, to lock crowns to blood. Those chains did not merely bind politics, they bound fleshbone and destiny. In the last days of Carlos II, the empire held its breath. Without an heir, Spain became a prize for Europe's great powers, and his death ignited the War of the Spanish Succession. But beyond the treaties and the battlefields, the image of the bewitched king lingered a man broken by the very dynasty that produced him. His frailty, the living symbol of ambition, carried too far. Thus ended the Spanish Habsburgs not with a blaze of glory, but with the frail sigh of a body undone by its own lineage. Juana, who had once walked by night with her husband's corpse, had given life to a dynasty that conquered continents. And yet in the end her bloodline became a prison more terrible than any she endured at Tordesillas. The last Habsburg died alone in his chamber, his empire crumbling his body a testament that dynasties chained to bloodlines may win kingdoms, but they also inherit tragedy. The silent chains of power. Lessons from Juana of Castile. History often remembers Juana of Castile as Juana la Loca, the mad queen who clung to her husband's coffin and whispered to shadows. Yet when we look closer, a different picture emerges. Hers is not just a story of madness, but of politics, inheritance, and the cruel machinery of dynasties that demanded bloodlines over humanity. Juana was born into a family where every child was a treaty, every marriage a weapon, every womb a battlefield. From the moment of her birth, her value was measured not in herself, but in the alliances her body could forge. She was intelligent, passionate, and deeply human, but those qualities became threats. Her fire was called hysteria, her resistance called madness, her grief called delusion. In truth, Juana's tragedy was not her instability, but the way her natural emotions were weaponized to silence her. Her captivity at Tordesillas became a metaphor for how societies often treat those who do not fit their expectations. To cry too loudly, to love too fiercely, to refuse the compromises demanded, these became evidence of her unfitness to rule. And so she lived nearly half a century in a prison, her voice erased while her name legitimized the power of others. The irony is bitter. Juana was silenced as unstable while her descendants carried forward the true instability not of mind, but of blood. The Habsburg obsession with dynastic purity folded generation into generation until it produced Carlos II, a king so frail that his body became a monument to decline. What Juana endured as personal tragedy foreshadowed a dynasty's collapse, showing that power chained to blood alone is power doomed to wither. From this story emerge lessons that resonate far beyond palaces and crowns. First, the danger of silencing voices. Juana's warnings, her demands for dignity might have altered her dynasty's path had they been heard rather than dismissed. Too often in our own lives, voices that challenge the norm, whether of women, of the vulnerable, or of those who refuse conformity, are easier to label as irrational than to listen to. Yet it is often those silenced voices that hold the truth we most need. Second, the limits of power built only on inheritance. The Habsburgs clung to bloodlines as if they were eternal walls of stone. In reality, those walls became cages. True strength, whether in families, organizations, or nations, comes from renewal, openness, and adaptation, not from closing in upon oneself. Third, the endurance of human dignity. Juana was denied the throne, her freedom, even her role as mother. Yet she survived for 75 years, outlasting her father-husband and many of her enemies. Her very endurance is a lesson. Sometimes resilience is not in conquering, but in refusing to vanish. The story of Juana and the Habsburgs is a mirror to our own age. It asks us to see how ambition can blind, how systems can devour individuals, and how memory, if we choose to remember honestly, can restore dignity to those once erased. Juana's life reminds us that power without compassion corrodes, that silence can be as deadly as chains, and that the worth of a person can never be reduced to lineage or function. In remembering her not as La Loca but as Juana the Queen, we reclaim a truth long buried: humanity outlasts empire. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.